place where young minds are supposed to feel safe, where dreams are meant to be nurtured, and where respect should never be negotiable. Yet one teacher forgot that lesson. And the day he mocked a young boy's accent, he thought he had the final word. But he didn't know who was waiting outside that door. The bell had just rung at Roosevelt High School, a school sitting on the edge of a proud but struggling neighborhood. In room 2B, 25 students sat hunched over their desks, shuffling papers and whispering. At the front stood Mr. Dalton, a history teacher who prided himself on being tough. But tough wasn't the right word. The students knew him for what he really was: sharp-tongued, arrogant, and cruel when he felt powerful. That day, his target was Jaden Haniel, a 15-year-old boy who had just transferred from Nigeria. Jaden was bright, curious, hungry to learn. But he carried something that set him apart: his accent. Thick, melodic, rooted in a language older than the very classroom he sat in. It was the accent of his home, his family, his people. But to Mr. Dalton, it was something else. Something he thought was worth mocking. "Jaden," Dalton barked, flipping through the attendance sheet. "Why don't you read the next passage for us?" The boy's heart raced. He cleared his throat. Slowly, carefully, he began to read. At first, the room was silent. But then, it happened. A stumble. A word slightly bent by his accent. Not wrong. Just different. And Mr. Dalton pounced. Dalton smirked. "Excuse me, what was that word again?" He cupped his ear dramatically. "Say it slower. Maybe we'll understand you this time." The class shifted uncomfortably. A few students laughed nervously. Others looked down, pretending not to notice. Jaden flushed red, his hands trembling. He repeated the word, softer this time. Dalton chuckled, shaking his head. "Class, did anyone catch that? Because I sure didn't." The laughter grew. Not from cruelty but from fear of being the next target. And that's when Dalton delivered the final blow. "Well, Jaden, maybe when you learn to speak properly, we'll let you read again. Until then, keep practicing. Maybe at home with your tribe?" The room erupted. Some students gasped. Some looked away. And Jaden? He froze. The humiliation clamped around his throat. He wanted to disappear. What Mr. Dalton didn't know was that someone else had heard it all. Because sitting in the hallway just outside the cracked door was Jaden's father, Gibson Haniel. Gibson had come early to pick up his son. A factory worker by day, he had swapped shifts with a coworker just to be there. Because to him, education wasn't just important. It was survival. And now, through that thin door, he had heard everything. Every insult. Every laugh. Every word that cut into his son. And something inside him began to stir. When the bell finally rang, the students rushed out. Some whispering, some silent. Jaden sat still, his shoulders slumped. He wanted to cry, but he wouldn't. He couldn't. Not here. Not in front of the man who had just torn him apart. Dalton barely glanced at him. He was already gathering his papers, humming to himself like nothing had happened. But before Jaden could stand, the door opened. The air shifted. Every head turned. In walked Gibson Haniel. Tall, broad-shouldered, his work clothes still dusted with the grit of labor. But it wasn't his size that commanded the room. It was his eyes. Sharp, unflinching, carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much to be fooled by arrogance. He looked at his son, then at the teacher. And the silence that followed was heavier than any bell. "Mr. Dalton?" Gibson's voice was calm, measured, but beneath it there was steel. Dalton straightened, forcing a smile. "Ah, Mr. Haniel, I presume? You're a bit early for pickup. We were just finishing." Gibson raised a hand. "No, you were not finishing. You were humiliating my son." Dalton blinked. The words landed like a slap. The students who hadn't yet left froze at the doorway watching. And Jaden, for the first time all day, he lifted his head. Dalton cleared his throat. "I assure you, sir, you must have misunderstood. I was simply trying to help him with his pronunciation." Gibson stepped forward. Each word deliberate. "Help is not what I heard. What I heard was mockery. What I heard was a man who calls himself a teacher, stripping away the dignity of a child. My child." The room was silent. Even the walls seemed to lean closer. Dalton's smile faltered. "I think you're overreacting." Gibson's eyes narrowed. "No, Mr. Dalton. For once in your classroom, someone is reacting just enough." Gibson turned to his son. "Jaden, stand." The boy hesitated, then rose slowly. "Repeat the word you read earlier," Gibson said gently. Jaden whispered it. "Louder," his father urged. "Let them hear you." Jaden repeated it, his voice firmer this time. Gibson nodded. Perfect. You spoke it perfectly. Do you know why? The boy shook his head. Because it carried your truth, your voice, your history. And no man, no matter his title, has the right to shame you for it. The students watched, their eyes wide. Dalton shifted uncomfortably. But Gibson wasn't done. He turned back to the teacher. You think his accent is weakness? I tell you now, it is strength. Every syllable he speaks carries generations. Every tone carries pride you cannot erase. And one day, the very thing you mock will be the thing that makes him great. But today, you taught him a different lesson. You taught him what cruelty looks like when it hides behind authority. And I promise you, that lesson will not go unchallenged. Dalton tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. For the first time, the power in the room had shifted. And he knew it. Gibson placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Come, Jaden. We are done here. They began to walk toward the door. But just as they reached the threshold, Gibson stopped. He turned one last time, his voice low, but heavy with warning. Mr. Dalton, this is not the end. Tomorrow we will return. And the truth will sit in this classroom louder than your laughter ever did. And with that he walked out, leaving Dalton pale, the students whispering, and Jaden holding his head just a little higher. That day, everyone in that classroom learned something. The students learned that silence is dangerous. That when they laugh at someone else's pain, they become part of the cruelty. The teacher learned that arrogance has limits. And that those limits are often drawn by the very people he underestimates. And Jaden? He learned that his voice, his accent, his truth, was never something to be hidden. It was something to be defended. Because respect isn't given by titles. It is claimed by courage. But what no one in that room knew was that Gibson's words were only the beginning. Because the next morning, when he returned with his son, he wasn't alone. He wasn't just a father. He came as something more. Something that would shake the very foundation of Roosevelt High. The real question wasn't whether Dalton would answer for what he did. It was how far Gibson was willing to go to make sure every child in that school was treated with dignity. And when he walked back into that building, he wasn't just carrying his son's pain. He was carrying a storm. Some storms arrive with thunder. Others arrive in silence, growing louder with every heartbeat. And when Gibson Haniel promised that he would return the next day, he didn't just return as a father. He returned as a force. Because what happened in room 2B wasn't just about one insult. It wasn't just about one teacher and one child. It was about a system. A system that had looked the other way too many times. A system that was about to face a reckoning it never saw coming. The sun rose over Roosevelt High, painting the old bricks gold. Students filed in, backpacks slung, chatter buzzing. But by mid-morning, everyone could feel it. Something was different. Because standing at the school gates was Gibson Haniel. But this time he wasn't alone. Beside him stood his wife, Sandra, quiet but fierce. Behind him, a small group of parents. And waiting just outside the entrance, a local journalist with a camera crew. Word had spread fast. Someone had leaked what happened in Dalton's class. And the community was not going to let it vanish into silence. Inside, Principal Harris sat at her desk, nervously tapping a pen. She had been principal for 15 years. Long enough to know trouble when she smelled it. And trouble had arrived. The door burst open. Gibson walked in, his shoulders square, his gaze steady. Jaden followed, his face a mix of nerves and pride. Behind them, the other parents squeezed in. Mr. Haniel, Principal Harris began cautiously. I understand there was an incident yesterday. I assure you the matter is being handled internally. But Gibson shook his head. No. Yesterday was not an incident. It was an insult. And insults do not vanish behind closed doors. Principal Harris swallowed. She pressed the intercom. Mr. Dalton, please report to my office. Moments later, Dalton arrived. His smirk had returned, though weaker this time. He glanced at Gibson, then at the crowd, and tried to regain control. I don't see why all this fuss is necessary, Dalton said lightly. It was a harmless joke. The boy needs to learn how to stop. Gibson's voice cut through the room like a blade. This ends today. The journalist's camera flickered on. The parents crossed their arms. And suddenly Dalton realized. This wasn't a private scolding. This was public. And the words he had once thrown carelessly in a classroom were about to be dragged into the light. Gibson stood tall. You mocked my son's accent. You stripped him of dignity in front of his peers. And now you call it a joke. Dalton shifted. Well? No, Gibson pressed. This is not about mispronunciation. This is about prejudice. Because when you mocked him, you weren't just mocking his voice. You were mocking his culture, his heritage, his very existence. Gasps rippled through the parents. The journalist leaned forward, hungry for every word. Dalton laughed nervously. This is being blown out of proportion. I treat all my students equally. Equally? One mother snapped. My son told me how you call students lazy when they struggle. How you pick favorites. Don't talk to us about equality. Another parent chimed in. My daughter came home crying last semester. Said you told her she wasn't college material. Do you remember that? The walls closed in. Dalton's smirk crumbled. For years he had gotten away with cruelty disguised as discipline. But now his words had come back. Every insult, every sneer, echoing in the mouths of those who had been silent too long. Principal Harris tried to intervene. Let's not turn this into a witch hunt. But Gibson raised a hand. No, Principal Harris. This is not a witch hunt. This is accountability. For too long, you've let this man sit in your classrooms unchecked. And for too long, children have walked home carrying wounds they cannot name. Today that ends. The room vibrated with murmurs of agreement. The journalist's camera caught every angle. And Dalton? He looked smaller than ever before. Then Gibson did something unexpected. He turned to his son. Jaden, tell them how you felt yesterday. The boy froze. His eyes darted around the room, then to the camera. His throat tightened. But then he remembered his father's words. Your voice carries history. He stepped forward. And in a trembling but steady voice he spoke. When he laughed at me, I felt like I didn't belong. Like my voice was wrong. Like I was wrong. But my father told me, my accent is not weakness. It is strength. And I will never be ashamed of it again. Silence. Tears filled his mother's eyes. The parents nodded, some wiping their own. And Dalton? He couldn't look at him. The journalist lowered her camera. This is not just a story about one boy. This is a story about a community. About the dignity of children. And about whether schools protect them or silence them. Principal Harris paled. She realized what this meant. Not just bad press. Not just angry parents. But a storm. A storm that could swallow her entire school. Gibson leaned forward. Here is what will happen. 1. This teacher will apologize to my son. Publicly. 2. The school will review his behavior, not quietly but openly with parents present. 3. You will implement training so no child ever suffers this again. The room erupted in murmurs of support. Parents nodded. The journalist scribbled furiously. Dalton opened his mouth but no sound came out. The power he once wielded was gone. That day Roosevelt High learned something powerful. They learned that silence protects the oppressor. But courage protects the oppressed. They learned that when one father stands, others will follow. And when a community finds its voice, even the strongest walls begin to crack. But as the parents left, as the cameras packed up, Gibson felt a chill. Because in the corner, watching silently, stood a man in a gray suit. Not a parent, not a teacher, but a member of the school district board. And as Gibson passed, the man leaned in and whispered, You've made your point today, Mr. Haniel. But be careful. The system doesn't like to be challenged. Gibson froze. For the first time he realized, this wasn't just about Dalton. This was bigger. And the real battle was only beginning. Storms don't always end when the rain stops. Sometimes the heaviest storm comes after. Quiet, calculated, hidden behind closed doors. Gibson Haniel had stood against a teacher and won. He had stood with parents and forced the truth into the light. But in doing so, he had awakened something far bigger. Because in this city, the school wasn't just a school. It was an institution. And institutions do not take kindly to being challenged. The day after the confrontation, Roosevelt High buzzed with whispers. Students replayed the moment Jaden spoke with pride. Parents traded stories in the parking lot. Even some teachers, long silent, began to wonder if they had looked away too often. But inside the district office just a few miles away, a very different conversation was happening. Behind heavy oak doors, the school board sat in a circle. At the head was Mr. Whitmore, the man in the gray suit who had whispered his warning to Gibson. He leaned forward, fingers steepled. This Haniel family has made us look weak. If parents believe they can walk into schools and dictate policy, we lose control. This cannot stand. The room murmured in agreement. And with that, the battle lines were drawn. It began small. 2 days later, Gibson arrived at the factory where he worked. His supervisor pulled him aside. Gibson, I don't know what's going on, but corporate called. They're reviewing your shifts. Might be cuts coming. Cuts. The word stung. 4 years, Gibson had worked overtime, double shifts, anything to provide. And now, suddenly, his position was under review? Coincidence? Or punishment? Gibson walked home that night with a heavy chest. But when he saw his son smiling, practicing his reading aloud with confidence, he clenched his jaw and whispered to himself, "They will not break me." At Roosevelt, Principal Harris made her move. One morning she called Gibson into her office. "Mr. Haniel, I understand your passion. But perhaps it would be best if Jaden transferred to another school. A fresh start." Gibson stared at her. A fresh start? Or a silencing? She shifted uncomfortably. "This is about what's best for your son." "No," Gibson said firmly. "This is about what's easiest for you." He stood, his voice steady. "My son will not run. Not from this place. Not from his truth. We stay." And with that he walked out, leaving Harris fuming, her authority crumbling. By now, word had spread beyond Roosevelt High. Churches spoke about it in sermons. Local radio stations debated the story. And soon, a community meeting was called. The small hall overflowed with parents, students, and neighbors. At the front stood Gibson, reluctant but determined. "I am no leader," he began softly. "I am just a father. But if they can silence my son today, they will silence your children tomorrow. And so I stand. Not because I want to, but because I must." Applause thundered. And in that moment, Gibson realized. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs. The next week, the board made its countermove. Letters were mailed. Formal notices posted. A disciplinary hearing was scheduled. Not for Mr. Dalton, but for Gibson. The charge? Disrupting school operations and intimidating staff. It was a clever trap. If Gibson refused to attend, he would look guilty. If he attended, they could twist his words against him. The system was no longer hiding. It was striking back. The night before the hearing, Gibson sat at the kitchen table, head in hands. Bills lay scattered. The factory had cut his overtime. Whispers of troublemaker followed him at work. Sandra placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do you regret it?" she asked gently. Gibson lifted his eyes, weary but fierce. "No. They want me tired. They want me broken. But tomorrow I will walk into that room with the truth. And truth does not bend." Jaden appeared at the doorway, clutching a notebook. "Papa," he said quietly, "if they don't listen to you, will they listen to me?" Gibson stared at his son. And for the first time, a new idea flickered in his mind. The next morning, the district building buzzed with tension. Parents lined the halls. Reporters gathered at the steps. Inside the chamber, a long table stretched beneath bright fluorescent lights. At one end sat the board members, stone-faced. At the other, Gibson. Principal Harris was there. So was Mr. Dalton, his smirk replaced with forced indignation. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat. "Mr. Haniel, you are here today to answer for your disruptive actions. You embarrassed staff, undermined authority, and created a hostile environment. How do you plead?" Gibson stood. His voice was calm. "I plead guilty to loving my son. Guilty to protecting his dignity. Guilty to speaking truth when silence was easier. If that is a crime, then I am guilty indeed." Gasps filled the room. Even the journalist's pen paused mid-scribble. But Gibson wasn't finished. Gibson turned to the board. "You asked me to answer. But the true answer comes from the boy you tried to silence. Jaden. Speak." The board shifted uncomfortably. "This is highly irregular." But Jaden stepped forward. His voice wavered, then steadied. "You called my father disruptive. But he only spoke because I was hurt. And you called me different. But I am not different. I am me. And I will not change my voice to make anyone comfortable. Not anymore." The room fell silent. Even the board members avoided his gaze. For a brief moment it felt like victory. Like truth had pierced the walls. But then, Mr. Whitmore leaned forward, his smile cold. "Moving words. But this is not about emotions. It is about order. And this district cannot allow chaos. Therefore, we recommend disciplinary action against Mr. Haniel, and the immediate reassignment of his son to another school." The gavel struck. The sound echoed like thunder. Gasps erupted. Reporters scribbled. Parents shouted. Gibson stood frozen. They had heard the truth. They had felt it. And still, they chose power over justice. That day, Gibson learned something painful. He learned that the system doesn't break because of one truth. It bends, it twists, it resists, because power never yields easily. But he also learned something else. That once a community finds its voice, it cannot be silenced forever. As the room cleared, Gibson gathered his family. His hands trembled with rage and exhaustion. But as they reached the doors, Mr. Whitmore's voice followed. "You've made a spectacle, Mr. Haniel. But remember, when men fight the system they rarely win. Be careful, or you may lose more than you realize." Gibson turned, his eyes burning. But before he could speak, Jaden tugged at his sleeve. "Papa, look." In the hallway beyond, dozens of parents and students stood waiting. Their faces fierce, their voices rising. They began to chant, "Justice for our children! Justice for our children!" Gibson looked at his son, then at the crowd. And he knew. The battle was far from over. Because the system had declared war. And now, the community was ready to fight back. The system had drawn its line in the sand. Gibson Haniel had stood his ground. And the board thought they had won. But power doesn't belong to the few. Not when the many discover their voice. And in the days that followed the hearing, Roosevelt High would learn a truth no institution can escape. That once a community rises, it cannot be silenced again. The morning after the board's ruling, Gibson woke to a sound he never expected. Not silence. Not despair. But voices. Outside his small apartment building, parents and students had gathered. Some held signs. Some carried cameras. All carried determination. Painted across cardboard in bold letters were words like, "Respect our children. Accent is identity. Justice for Jaden." Gibson stepped to the window, stunned. Sandra placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. By noon, the crowd had doubled. Parents, students, church leaders, even local shopkeepers joined. They marched from the neighborhood to Roosevelt High. Their chants shook the streets. "Our children. Our voice. Dignity in the classroom." At the front walked Gibson, holding Jaden's hand. Each step was heavy, but each shout behind him gave him strength. Reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. And suddenly, the story that began in one classroom was everywhere. On the evening news, across social media, whispered in boardrooms. But institutions don't crumble quietly. They push back. That night, the district released a statement. "While we value diversity, we cannot condone disruptive behavior from parents. Roosevelt High continues to provide a safe and respectful learning environment for all students." Safe. Respectful. The words dripped with irony. And the community knew it. Still, for Gibson, the weight grew heavier. At work, co-workers whispered. At the grocery store, strangers stared. Some cheered him on. Others shook their heads, muttering, "Troublemaker." And at home, the bills piled higher. The overtime he once relied on was gone. 2 days later, Gibson sat across from a local TV host. The bright studio lights stung his eyes. The cameras pointed straight at him. The host leaned forward. "Mr. Haniel, some say you're a hero. Others say you're stirring division. What do you say?" Gibson paused. He thought of his son. He thought of the laughter in that classroom. Then he spoke slowly, each word steady. "I am not here to divide. I am here to remind. Children deserve dignity. Accents are not mistakes. And when authority mocks, it teaches cruelty. I will not be silent, because silence is how injustice survives." The studio was still. The host swallowed hard. And when the cameras cut, Gibson knew. His voice had gone beyond his neighborhood. But victory came with wounds. That night, Gibson's supervisor called again. "Gibson, I'm sorry. The company says we have to let you go. Downsizing, they say." Downsizing. The word was a knife. He knew the truth. It wasn't about downsizing. It was about pressure. He hung up, his chest heavy. Sandra sat beside him, tears in her eyes. "How much more will they take from us?" she whispered. Gibson clenched his fists. "As much as we let them." The very next day, something remarkable happened. It wasn't just parents marching now. It was students. Hundreds of them. Not just from Roosevelt, but from neighboring schools. They walked out of classrooms holding signs high. "We are not your joke. We belong. Our voices matter." The streets swelled with their chants. Teachers peeked from windows. Some cheered quietly. Others scowled. And at the front of it all was Jaden, standing on a step, shouting louder than he ever had. "My voice is not wrong." The crowd roared in answer. And for the first time, the boy who once hid in shame now stood as a leader. Inside Roosevelt, Principal Harris panicked. The media flooded the gates. The board called her phone endlessly. And teachers whispered about her crumbling authority. Finally, she called Dalton into her office. "This is getting out of control," she snapped. You've brought us into the spotlight, and now the whole district is under fire. Dalton sneered. Don't blame me. Blame that boy's father. He's turning this into a circus. But Harris wasn't convinced. She saw what Dalton couldn't. That the tide had shifted. And the crowd outside wasn't leaving. That night, Gibson returned home to find an envelope taped to his door. No name. No return address. Inside was a single note. Stop, or your family will pay the price. Gibson froze. His heart pounded. He showed Sandra, her face pale. What do we do? She whispered. Gibson stared at the note, his jaw tight. They want fear. They will not get it. But deep inside he knew. This fight was no longer just about dignity. It was becoming dangerous. That week, Gibson learned something powerful. That when you speak truth to power, power does not bow quietly. It resists. It punishes. It threatens. But he also learned that courage is not the absence of fear. It is standing anyway even when fear knocks hardest at your door. And now, with his job gone, his family threatened, and the whole city watching, Gibson faced a choice. Step back, or step forward into the storm. At the next community meeting, the hall overflowed again. Parents, students, church leaders, even local reporters packed every seat. Gibson walked to the front, holding the threatening note in his hand. He raised it high for all to see. They think this will silence me. They think fear will end this fight. But let me tell you, fear ends here. We will not stop. We will not bow. We will march louder than ever. Because our children's dignity is worth every risk. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause. But as the chant shook the walls, Gibson caught sight of someone in the back. Mr. Whitmore. The board member stood in the shadows, arms folded, a thin smile on his face. And beside him, two men Gibson had never seen before. They weren't parents. They weren't teachers. And the way they watched him made Gibson's blood run cold. Because this wasn't just about schools anymore. This was about power. And the people who would do anything to protect it. Every battle reaches a moment. A line too sharp to ignore. A wound too deep to hide. For Gibson Haniel, that moment had arrived. He had stood against a mocking teacher. He had faced a board that silenced truth. He had lost his job, his security, and nearly his peace. And now, with threats at his door and shadows watching his every move, he stood at the breaking point. The question wasn't if the fight would cost him more. The question was, how much more would he be willing to lose? After the meeting, Gibson walked his family home. But his eyes kept flicking behind him. The two men who stood beside Whitmore, they were following. Not close enough to confront. Not far enough to disappear. At one street corner, Gibson stopped and turned. The men halted, silent, their expressions unreadable. Then slowly they melted into the night. Sandra gripped his arm. Gibson, who are they? He shook his head, jaw tight. They're the kind of men who don't need names. The Haniel home changed. Every knock at the door made Sandra jump. Every phone call felt like a threat. Even Jaden, once fearless, now slept with the light on. One evening, Gibson found his son scribbling in a notebook. What are you writing? He asked gently. Jaden held it up. They cannot take my voice. Gibson swallowed hard. Even in fear, his son still believed. And Gibson knew he could not let that light die. The next day, Gibson received a message from someone unexpected. Mrs. Rivera, a teacher at Roosevelt, asked to meet privately. When they sat in the small corner of a cafe, she leaned in. I've kept quiet too long, she whispered. What Dalton did to Jaden, he's done to others. Mocking accents, belittling students. We've filed complaints, but the board buries them. They protect him. Gibson frowned. Why protect a man like that? Rivera's eyes darted around before she answered. Because Dalton's brother-in-law is a district lawyer. And the board cares more about connections than children. Gibson sat back, rage simmering. The system wasn't broken by accident. It was built this way. That night, Gibson wrestled with a question. Should he go public with Rivera's words? Or protect her from the same retaliation he faced? Sandra watched him pace. You can't fight this alone, she said softly. Every voice matters. If she's willing to stand with you, let her. Gibson stopped. She was right. The board's power thrived on silence. And silence was no longer an option. The next weekend, the community organized the largest protest yet. Hundreds poured into the streets. Parents, students, teachers, neighbors. Signs lifted high. Chants thundered. And this time they marched not just to Roosevelt High, but all the way to the district office. Gibson, Sandra, Jaden, and Mrs. Rivera stood at the front. Cameras rolled as Gibson raised his voice. You tried to silence us in classrooms. You tried to silence us in hearings. You tried to silence us with threats. But hear this, our voices will not be buried. The crowd erupted. The building shook with their chants. And for the first time, the board members inside could not ignore the sound. But power never yields without striking back. The very next morning, the city newspaper released a headline. Factory worker disrupts schools. Gibson Haniel's troubled past raises questions. The article twisted his story, painting him as an angry man, irresponsible, unfit to lead. It hinted at debts, at aggressive behavior, at rumors Gibson knew were lies. Gibson held the paper in shaking hands. This is how they fight, he muttered. They can't kill the truth, so they try to kill the messenger. Sandra touched his arm. But the people know you. They've seen you. Lies don't last forever. Still, Gibson felt the sting. It wasn't just his fight anymore. Now they were smearing his very name. That night, as Gibson sat in silence, Jaden crawled onto his lap. Papa, he said softly, remember when I was scared to read out loud? Gibson nodded. You told me, the only way to beat fear is to speak anyway. So maybe you have to do the same. Gibson froze. From the mouth of his son came the truth he most needed. He smiled faintly, pressing his forehead to Jaden's. You're right. I cannot hide now. Days later, a shock rippled through the community. Another parent stepped forward. Then another. And another. One after one, families came out with stories of Dalton mocking their children. Their accents, their clothes, their families. And then, the biggest surprise of all. A former teacher who had left the district appeared at a rally. She lifted a folder high. These, she shouted, are the complaints the board buried. Signed. Dated. Ignored. The crowd roared. Reporters swarmed. The wall of silence had cracked. Gibson stood at the center of the storm and realized something profound. They had tried to make him small. But in fighting back, he had given others courage. And now, what began as one father's defense of his son had become a movement no board could contain. This was bigger than him. Bigger than Jaden. This was about every child whose voice had been mocked into silence. But just as momentum soared, the shadows moved again. One evening, Gibson received a call. A voice, deep and calm. Mr. Haniel, this is Robert Whitmore. I think it's time we talk. Gibson's chest tightened. Whitmore never called directly. Meet me tomorrow. No cameras. No crowd. Just you and me. Why? Gibson asked coldly. Whitmore's answer was smooth, deliberate. Because I can make all of this go away. Your job. Your reputation. Your peace. All you have to do is step back. The line went dead. Gibson sat frozen, the phone heavy in his hand. He knew what this was. It wasn't an offer. It was a test. And tomorrow he would have to choose. Bargain with power. Or defy it completely. Some fights are lost in silence. Others are lost in compromise. But there are rare fights. The kind where a man refuses to bow, refuses to break. And in standing he forces the world to bend instead. For Gibson Haniel, today was that day. The morning was heavy. The deal Whitmore offered weighed on Gibson's chest like a stone. One choice promised safety. A job. A paycheck. Silence. The other promised chaos. More threats. More struggle. But maybe truth. Sandra set breakfast on the table, her eyes searching his. Gibson. Whatever choice you make, you won't make it alone. Gibson looked at his wife. His son. And in that moment, the answer became clear. He would not bow. That afternoon, Gibson walked into the private meeting Whitmore arranged. The district office was empty, eerily quiet. Whitmore sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, flanked by the same two men who had followed Gibson before. Mr. Haniel, Whitmore began smoothly, you've stirred quite a storm. But storms end. And I'm offering you a way out. He slid a folder across the table. Inside, a reinstatement letter for Gibson's factory job. A settlement check. All signed. All waiting for his name. All you need to do, Whitmore said, is withdraw your accusations. Publicly. Tell them you overreacted. And this all goes away. Gibson stared at the folder. Then slowly he pushed it back across the table. My voice is not for sale. My son's dignity is not for sale. Our community is not for sale. Whitmore's eyes hardened. You're making a mistake. No, Gibson said firmly. The mistake was thinking we'd stay silent. The very next morning, the movement unleashed its greatest weapon, truth. Mrs. Rivera, the former teacher, and 3 parents went live with the folder of buried complaints. The journalist who had first filmed Dalton's mocking incident released a special report. Headlines spread like wildfire. Board accused of cover-up. Parents demand accountability. Dalton protected by connections? And then came the breaking point. A video surfaced of Dalton himself years earlier, mocking a Latino student's accent in class. The video went viral. The board's carefully built wall cracked. And the public stormed through. A week later, the school district held a public hearing. For the first time, all sides faced each other in the open. Parents packed the room. Students held signs outside. Cameras lined the back wall. At the front sat Dalton, pale and shaken. Next to him, Whitmore, his calm mask thinning. And across from them, Gibson Haniel, standing tall. He spoke first. This is not just about one teacher. This is about every child who was told their voice was wrong. This is about every parent who was told to stay quiet. Today we refuse to stay silent. The room erupted in applause. Even the board members who once looked untouchable shifted nervously under the weight of the crowd's roar. One by one, parents gave testimony. Children told their stories. Teachers revealed what they had witnessed. The mountain of truth grew too large to deny. When Dalton was asked to respond, his voice cracked. It was never meant to hurt anyone. But his excuses were drowned by the voices of those he had wounded. Then came Whitmore's turn. He tried to spin the story, calling it a misunderstanding, blaming emotions. But the evidence, his ties to Dalton's brother-in-law, the buried complaints, was undeniable. The board could no longer protect him. The people had spoken louder than power. After hours of testimony, the board finally announced its decision. Mr. Dalton, terminated. Robert Whitmore, removed from his position pending investigation. New policies, mandatory cultural sensitivity training, transparent complaint processes and parent oversight committees, effective immediately. The room exploded in cheers. Tears streamed down faces. And for the first time, Gibson allowed himself to breathe. Justice. Not perfect, not complete, but real. That night, the community gathered at the park. Music played. Children laughed. Parents embraced. Gibson stood quietly watching. Sandra slipped her hand into his. "You did it," she whispered. He shook his head softly. "No, we did it." One voice started it, but many voices finished it. Jaden tugged his father's hand. "Papa," he said, "can I read my poem to everyone?" Gibson smiled. "Yes, son. The world is ready for your voice." And under the stars, Jaden stood on a small stage and read the words he had written. "They cannot take my voice, because my voice is not mine alone. Carries my family, carries my people, carries the truth, and truth will never be silent." The crowd roared. And Gibson knew, this was the moment his son would never forget. The fight had cost Gibson dearly, his job, his peace, his safety. But in the end it gave him something greater. It gave his son courage. It gave his community power. It gave the voiceless a voice. And the lesson was clear. When you mock a child for how they speak, you do not just mock a voice. You mock a history, a people, a dignity that cannot be erased. And when that dignity rises, even the strongest system must fall. As the night wound down, Gibson sat with his family. The fight was over for now. But he knew others would come. And when they did, he knew something else too. He would never face them alone again. Because the storm they unleashed wasn't Gibson's storm anymore. It belonged to every voice that refused to be silenced. And that was victory.